As a result, Australia is also at war.
It is feared that the Prime Minister has drowned.
He has misled the Parliament.
Welcome to the Political History of Australia podcast.
Any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up the day is a bum.
I will not be lectured by this man.
Why won't you call an early election?
Mate, because I want to do you slowly. I want to do you slowly.
With your host, John Ruddick.
Episode 3, Cook and Banks. In 1966, historian Geoffrey Blainey published The Tyranny of Distance, a landmark work on Australian history. His opening lines were,
"In the 18th century, the world was becoming one world, but Australia was still a world of its own. It was untouched by Europe's customs or commerce. It was more isolated than the Himalayas or the heart of Siberia."
The outside world was about to collide with Australia and its Indigenous people. Last week, we charted the escalating rivalry and suspicion between Britain and France in their efforts to explore and claim the South Pacific. This week, we meet the splendid partnership of James Cook and Joseph Banks. In popular culture, Captain Cook was an intrepid navigator who, aboard the Endeavour, sailed into the South Pacific to boldly go where no man had gone before and to explore strange new worlds. And yes, if that sounds a bit Star Trek-y, that's because the writer of Star Trek was a huge Cook fan. So, according to popular culture, Cook stumbled across the east coast of a continent, raised the Union Jack and declared that the eastern half of New Holland was to be New South Wales. As we have seen, this is a misleading simplification. When Cook departed on his first voyage to the Pacific, it was the third such British mission in 4 years. France was just as focused and just as active as Britain in the South Pacific. Also in popular culture, Cook is the hero of this chapter, while Joseph Banks is his nerdy, science-loving sidekick. And that is more than misleading. As we will see, Banks would return from the Pacific a celebrity and soon after be elected the President of the Royal Society, where he wielded influence at the highest echelons of the British Empire for over half a century. It would be Banks, not Cook, who would be in the driver's seat of transforming the claim of 1770 into the settlement of 1788. But let's start with James Cook, easily the greatest explorer of the world's largest geographical feature. Cook gave the world the Pacific map, or at least most of it. His 3 voyages to the Pacific took him from the Arctic to Antarctica and endless lands and islands in between. His efforts would finally lay to rest the myth of Terra Australis. In 1728, James Cook was born in Yorkshire in the north of England. Class was a big deal in the 18th century, and Cook was low class. But his life is testimony that skill and drive could see the son of a farm labourer rise into a legendary figure, especially if your career path was the Royal Navy. Cook had only 5 years of schooling, and at the age of 16 he moved to a coastal village. Shipping was the boom industry of the day, and the ambitious teenager found his calling. Cook first worked on commercial ships, but after 9 years and the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, at the age of 26, Cook joined the Royal Navy as an ordinary seaman. Within a month, he was promoted. Cook would remain in and rise in the Royal Navy for the rest of his life. When he was a merchant seaman, Cook had spent his spare time studying things like navigation, map making, and astronomy, all subjects in high demand within the Navy, and Cook's intelligence soon impressed. Cook himself was ambitious. Not long after joining the Navy, he said,
"Ambition leads me not only farther than any other man has been before me, but as far as it is possible for man to go."
After the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, around 9 in 10 men in the Royal Navy were discharged. But those with high potential, however, were retained, like Cook. 3 years later, when Cook was 38, his hard work and diligence paid off when he wrote a paper on an eclipse he had witnessed in the Atlantic. Cook's paper was of such quality that it was read to the Royal Society, receiving warm applause. Cook was now on the radar of the right people. 2 years later, the British were preparing for a third voyage of exploration in the South Pacific. As we saw last week, Alexander Dalrymple was initially offered leadership of that mission, but then that offer was abruptly rescinded. The 2 prior British voyages had backed away from venturing into the wild south of the Pacific, so they needed a Navy man on the rise and with guts, and it would help if he was good with map making and astronomy. Come on down, Lieutenant James Cook. On the 25th of May 1768, Cook was given command of the third British voyage to the South Pacific. Soon after Cook was appointed to command the ship the Endeavour, Joseph Banks was appointed the lead scientist of this officially scientific mission. It helped that Banks had made a sizable financial contribution. Banks was born into a wealthy English family. His father, grandfather and great-grandfathers had all been members of Parliament and wealthy landowners. He had attended Harrow, Eton and Oxford. Banks was a blue blood. Historian Margaret Cameron Ash describes Banks as
6 feet tall, dashingly handsome, and physically strong. He was intelligent, energetic, and ambitious, with notable good humour, questing curiosity, and winning enthusiasm.
In 1764, at the age of 18, Banks's father died, and when he turned 21, he inherited the lot. Banks never had to work again in his life. If Britain had a rich list in the day, Banks may not have been at the top of that list, but he certainly would have been on it. But Banks was no idle rich. He devoted his life to science and the expansion of the British Empire, plus many mistresses and long lunches along the way. In 1766, Banks sailed to modern-day Canada to study plants. He got badly seasick and then badly sick in Canada, but the trip whetted his appetite for discovery. He wrote a paper on the botany of Canada and was made a Fellow of the Royal Society aged 23, a decade before Cook was granted that honour. 2 years later, Banks heard about an upcoming British voyage to the Pacific, and he wanted in. A friend had suggested he do a tour of Europe, to which Banks replied,
"Every blockhead does that. My grand tour shall be one around the whole globe."
The Endeavour departed England on the 26th of August 1768. There was only one ship with 94 on board. Banks paid for 8 assistants to join him, mostly scientists. Cook and Banks had little in common. Banks was young, 26, and Cook middle-aged, 39. Banks was wealthy and privileged. Cook a farm labourer's son. Banks was charismatic and social. Cook serious and diligent. Banks was a visionary. Cook a technician. Cook was unknown, so the press had described the voyage as the Royal Society and Joseph Banks's voyage of scientific discovery. It was a little awkward at first, but Cook and Banks would have a stupendously successful professional relationship and an enduring friendship. Now, the Endeavour had 2 missions. The public and the crew were told the first mission, the study of the transit of Venus. The second was kept secret. Cook was told to only read the second after the Venus study was complete. The Endeavour sailed to the tip of South America and then north and west, and after 8 months at sea, arrived in Tahiti on the 13th of April 1769. They would stay for 3 months. The crew had a ball, but for the scientists on board, the priority was getting instruments set up to study the transit of Venus, which was due 6 weeks after their arrival in Tahiti. So, what's the transit of Venus? We hear more about Mars, but Venus is our nearest planetary neighbour. Occasionally, Venus passes between the Earth and the Sun. Telescopes have been around since Galileo's time 2 centuries earlier, and they were now reasonably advanced. Scientists had previously observed Venus through their telescopes as a little black dot passing across the Sun. Observing a transit of Venus across the Sun was more than mere curiosity. A century and a half earlier, Edmund Halley, the comet's namesake, had worked out that if we knew how far Earth was from the Sun, then the accuracy of the lines of longitude, i.e. up and down, on world maps would be near precise. Perfecting navigation was the AI tech of the day. Halley said we would calculate the distance from the Sun by observing how long it took the little black dot of Venus to pass in front of the Sun. It was known that it took about 6 hours, but Halley said that if that length of time was measured down to the last second, and simultaneously in multiple locations around the globe, then mankind would know how far we were from the Sun. There had been a transit of Venus as recently as only 8 years earlier, but attempts to measure at that time failed, so extra care was taken to ensure success in 1769. They had to get it right this time, or they'd wait another 105 years for the next transit. So scientists around the world collaborated and commissioned around 70 observation missions from Cape Town to St. Petersburg and, of course, Tahiti. When amateur astronomer King George III of Britain had heard about how important this was, he tipped in much of the cash for the Endeavour. On the 3rd of June 1769, Cook and Banks's observation of the transit of Venus were a success, as were many of the other observation projects around the world, and when all the data was compiled, world scientists came within 3% of calculating the distance between Earth and the Sun. The first mission of the Endeavour was now mission accomplished. So Cook opened and read what were referred to as the additional instructions. And surprise, surprise, he was off to discover and claim Terra Australis for the Kingdom of Great Britain. Unlike Bougainville's instructions, there was no mention of finding New Holland. But the British were familiar with Abel Tasman's report of New Zealand, and Cook was instructed to sail from Tahiti to the south and the west and to check out New Zealand. Just how big was New Zealand, and was it a part of the missing mega-continent? Cook was alarmed when his Tahitian hosts mentioned that the French had been recent guests, departing not too long before Cook's arrival. As we saw last week, Louis Bougainville and the French were soon to see but not land in what we know as North Queensland. Cook incorrectly guessed Bougainville was up to the same thing as him, racing for Terra Australis. What Cook didn't know was that at that very moment, there was another French expedition on its way to New Zealand, but coming from the opposite direction via India. That French mission was not a project of the French Navy, but of the French East India Company. It was a commercial mission, and on a mission to find and trade with Terra Australis. As Cook was preparing to depart Tahiti, Banks convinced him to let a Tahitian named Tupaia to tag along. Cook was reluctant, but Banks showed him a map Tupaia had of 130 islands in the southwest direction, precisely where they were headed. Tupaia was keen to jump aboard, and Banks assured Cook that he would look after him when they arrived back in England. Sailing southwest from Tahiti, Cook and Banks found several small islands and claimed them for Great Britain. They then sailed due south, but yet again it was cold and wild, and so they turned west, reaching New Zealand on the 6th of October 1769. They were the first Europeans to visit the land of the Long White Cloud since Abel Tasman a century and a half earlier. Joseph Banks took one look at it and was convinced. This green, fertile, mountainous, majestic land, this land of the Lord of the Rings, was absolutely definitely Terra Australis. Cook, he was less sure. Over the next 6 months, they circumnavigated New Zealand and mapped a land the size of Italy. And in the process proved that while it was two quite large islands, it was no megacontinent. Meanwhile, that French commercial voyage from India arrived in New Zealand just a few weeks after Cook. It wouldn't be the last remarkable Anglo-French coincidence of timing in this region, but unlike Captain La Perouse, who we'll soon meet, the British and the French had no idea they were simultaneously in New Zealand waters, and at one point were likely only 30 kilometres apart. The French captain was Jean-François Marie de Surville. Born in 1717, Surville was now 52. He had a career in the French Navy as an officer, and then joined the French East India Company with grand commercial plans. On the 3rd of March 1769, Surville had departed India. His ship was much larger than Cook's and packed with all the goods he could fit on board so he could trade with the merchants of Terra Australis. Surville sailed through Southeast Asia and then up to the Philippines, and then due south, heading directly for Abel Tasman's report of New Zealand. For thousands of kilometres, they were sailing parallel to the east coast of New Holland, but land remained out of sight. The French knew land was there. Sailors can smell land. But they wrongly assumed this east coast of New Holland would be similar to the barren west coast, and so didn't bother to check it out. They were also in a hurry. While Cook had spent 6 months exploring all of New Zealand's coastline, Surville left New Zealand after just 19 days. His crew was sick and many had died. On top of that, winter was coming. Surville considered turning either back to India or to sail north to resupply. But unlike Byron, Wallace and now Cook, Surville valiantly pressed on with the mission. Surville headed for South America, expecting at some point to find Terra Australis. But they didn't find any land, of course. They did make it to South America, where Surville drowned attempting to land. Surville's voyage was the second occasion, with more to come, of the French coming oh so close to claiming the east coast of New Holland. After sailing around New Zealand on the 31st of March 1770, the wise man of the sea, James Cook, raised the white flag on Terra Australis, writing in his journal that
must be allowed to have set aside most, if not all, the arguments and proofs that have been advanced by different authors to prove that there must be a southern continent.
So Terra Australis wasn't quite dead. There would be more attempts to find it, but death was nigh. And just around the corner, Cook would discover something that the ancient myth had hid from earlier European discovery. Banks, on the other hand, was still a Terra Australis true believer, and was bitterly disappointed to be giving up, writing in his journal,
"A southern continent really exists. I firmly believe it."
With New Zealand mapped, Cook considered sailing towards South America just to be sure Terra Australis wasn't there, but he was worried about the fierce ocean and the coming winter and the state of the ship and the crew, so Cook wanted to head home via the East Indies. And since he was in the neighbourhood, Cook decided to check out that unmapped eastern coastline of New Holland. No European had bothered to look before, so Cook decided that he would. While in New Zealand, Cook had near daily interactions with many Maori tribes. Tupaia, the Tahitian guide, was invaluable as he could talk their Polynesian lingo. Relations were sometimes bad, but unlike the French, were mostly good. Near modern Auckland, some Maoris told Cook that there was a, quote, very large country to the northwest that took a month to get to in a very large canoe. Surely Cook knew they were referring to New Holland. After New Zealand, Cook's official instructions had told him that he could make up his own mind on the return route to England. So join us next episode as the Endeavour heads home and makes the greatest discovery of this great explorer's life.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Political History of Australia podcast with your host, John Ruddick. Click follow to receive episode notifications, and leaving a review helps others find the podcast.